deep in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where the canopy blocks out the sun and the sounds of civilization fade into whispers, something impossible stands waiting. Massive stone structures, carved with precision, that defies everything we know about ancient civilizations. Megaliths that shouldn't exist, built by people who supposedly had no knowledge of advanced engineering, no metal tools, no written language. And yet, there they are, silent and immovable, challenging every textbook, every timeline, every comfortable assumption we've made about human history. What you're about to see will make you question everything. Not just about the Amazon, not just about ancient civilizations, but about who we really are as a species and what knowledge we may have lost to time. Because scattered throughout this jungle, hidden beneath centuries of vegetation and deliberate concealment, are architectural achievements that modern science cannot explain. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together with tolerances tighter than a human hair, arranged in patterns that mirror star constellations from thousands of years ago. The indigenous people who still live near these sites have stories. Stories passed down through generations about the sky people who came before the flood, about a time when the jungle was different, when giants walked the earth and moved stones with their minds. Stories that archaeologists dismissed as mythology until the day they started finding proof that maybe, just maybe, these weren't stories at all. My name is Alex, and I've spent the last 3 years investigating reports of impossible archaeology in some of the most remote corners of our planet. What I've discovered in the Amazon has shaken me to my core, not just because of what these structures represent, but because of how desperately certain institutions seem to want them to remain hidden. 3 separate research expeditions have been mysteriously shut down. Funding has been pulled without explanation. And when local guides started talking to journalists, they began receiving visits from people who suggested they might want to stop talking. But the stones don't lie. And today, we're going to walk through evidence so compelling, so undeniable, that it will force you to confront a possibility that changes everything. That human civilization is far, far older than we've been taught, and that knowledge which could revolutionize our world has been deliberately buried beneath the green hell of the Amazon. Let me start with something that will grab your attention immediately. In 2019, a team of geologists using ground-penetrating radar discovered what they initially thought was a natural rock formation deep in the Brazilian Amazon, about 400 miles southwest of Manaus. The readings showed massive stone structures arranged in geometric patterns, buried under decades of jungle growth. When they finally reached the site and began clearing the vegetation, what they found defied every principle of archaeology they'd ever learned. Stone blocks. Not just any stone blocks, but precisely cut granite and basalt formations, some weighing over 200 tons, arranged in perfect circles, squares, and triangular patterns. The surface of each block was smooth as glass, with edges so sharp and precise that even today, with our diamond-tipped cutting tools and laser-guided machinery, we would struggle to replicate this level of craftsmanship. But here's the part that made the lead archaeologist literally sit down in stunned silence. There were no tool marks. None. These massive stones had been cut and shaped with a precision that left no trace of how it was accomplished. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's impressive. But maybe ancient people were just more skilled than we give them credit for. Maybe they had techniques we've forgotten. But here's where it gets really strange. Carbon dating of organic material found embedded in the stone joints placed these structures at over 12,000 years old. 12,000 years. That's not just older than any known civilization in South America. It's older than Göbekli Tepe, older than Stonehenge, older than anything we've found anywhere that demonstrates this level of sophisticated construction. Think about what the world was like 12,000 years ago. Officially, according to every history textbook, humans were just beginning to figure out agriculture. We were hunter-gatherers living in small tribes, struggling to survive the end of the last ice age. The wheel hadn't been invented. Neither had writing, or mathematics, or metallurgy. And yet, somehow, people in the Amazon were moving stones that weigh as much as a Boeing 747 and arranging them with astronomical precision. But weight and precision are just the beginning. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a structural engineer who was part of the initial survey team, told me something that still gives me chills. She said these structures show evidence of construction techniques that we've only developed in the last century. Load distribution methods that require advanced understanding of physics. Joint systems that account for seismic activity in ways that suggest knowledge of geological processes we didn't discover until the 1900s. When I asked her how ancient people could have possessed this knowledge, she just shook her head and said, they couldn't have. Not with the tools and understanding we believe they had access to. Either our entire timeline of human development is wrong, or something else was going on here. Something else was going on here. Let that sink in for a moment. A structural engineer with over 20 years of experience, looking at constructions that should not exist, and concluding that our fundamental understanding of human history might be completely incorrect. And this isn't an isolated incident. Over the past decade, similar discoveries have been emerging from jungle locations across South America. Sites in Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, all showing the same impossible characteristics. Massive stones, precision cutting, astronomical alignments, and dates that push back the timeline of advanced human civilization by thousands of years. The mainstream archaeological community has been remarkably quiet about these discoveries. Papers submitted to major journals have been rejected without explanation. Conference presentations have been cancelled. Researchers who try to publish their findings suddenly find their funding pulled and their academic careers threatened. There's a systematic effort to keep this information out of public discourse, and that alone should tell you something significant is happening here. But the stones themselves are only part of the mystery. Because when you start looking at the broader patterns, at how these sites are distributed across the continent, something even more extraordinary emerges. They're not random. They're not scattered haphazardly through the jungle. They're arranged in a precise geometric network that spans thousands of miles, with each site positioned at exact distances from the others, creating patterns that mirror constellations visible in the night sky 12,000 years ago. Imagine the level of planning and coordination required for something like that. This wasn't a single tribe building a monument for their local area. This was a continent-wide construction project that required precise astronomical knowledge, advanced surveying techniques, and a level of organization that we associate with modern nation-states, not prehistoric hunter-gatherers. And here's where it gets even stranger. Local indigenous communities, tribes that have lived in these areas for generations, have detailed oral traditions about these sites. They call them the works of the ancient ones, the sky people who came before the Great Flood. According to their stories, these weren't built by human hands at all, but by beings who could move stones with their thoughts, who understood the secrets of the earth and sky, who possessed knowledge that was lost when the waters rose and covered the old world. Now, I'm not here to tell you that aliens built these structures, but I am here to tell you that we need to seriously reconsider what we think we know about ancient human capabilities. Because the evidence is overwhelming that someone, somewhere in the distant past, possessed technological and engineering knowledge that rivals or exceeds our own modern abilities. The implications of this are staggering. If these structures are genuine, if the dating is accurate, if the construction techniques are as advanced as they appear, then we're looking at proof that human civilization has risen and fallen before, that we've achieved heights of knowledge and capability, only to lose it all and have to start over. That the timeline we've been taught, the gradual progression from primitive to advanced, is not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. Think about what this means for our understanding of ourselves, of our potential, of our history. We've been told that we're living at the pinnacle of human achievement, that our technology and knowledge represent the highest point our species has ever reached. But what if that's not true? What if we're actually rediscovering knowledge that was once commonplace? What if the lost civilization that built these impossible structures had capabilities we're only beginning to understand? This isn't just about ancient history. This is about who we are right now, in this moment. Because if humans possessed this kind of knowledge 12,000 years ago, if they could move massive stones with precision we can barely match today, if they understood astronomical and geological principles we're still figuring out, then what other knowledge might be buried out there? What other capabilities might we have forgotten? And more importantly, why does it seem like certain institutions are so determined to keep us from finding out? The resistance to investigating these sites isn't passive. It's active, coordinated, and systematic. Research permits are denied. Funding disappears. Academic careers are destroyed. Indigenous guides who lead researchers to these locations receive threats. Satellite imagery of certain areas is restricted or deliberately obscured. This isn't just academic conservatism or scientific skepticism. This is suppression. Why? What's so threatening about the possibility that ancient humans were more advanced than we've been taught? What's so dangerous about the idea that our civilization might not be the first to achieve this level of sophistication? Unless, of course, the answer to those questions reveals something that powerful interests would prefer to keep hidden. But the truth has a way of emerging no matter how deeply it's buried. And in the Amazon, beneath centuries of jungle growth and deliberate concealment, the truth is literally carved in stone. Massive, impossible, undeniable stone that challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our past. Over the next several parts of this investigation, we're going to explore these sites in detail. We're going to examine the evidence, hear from the researchers who've risked their careers to study these structures, and listen to the indigenous voices who've been trying to tell us this story for generations. We're going to look at the construction techniques that shouldn't exist, the astronomical alignments that demonstrate impossible knowledge, and the systematic efforts to keep this information from reaching the public. We're going to follow the trail of evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the conclusions might be. Because if these structures are what they appear to be, if the dating is accurate, if the implications are real, then we're not just looking at a few interesting archaeological anomalies. We're looking at proof that everything we've been taught about human history, about our capabilities, about our place in the timeline of civilization, is wrong. And that changes everything. The first time I saw photographs of the Monte Alegre site, I thought they had to be fake. Computer-generated images designed to fool gullible people on the internet. Because what I was looking at simply couldn't exist. Not in the middle of the Amazon. Not built by people who supposedly lived in grass huts and hunted with stone spears. But then I met Carlos Mendoza, a geologist who'd spent 6 months at the site, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This was a man who'd seen something that broke his understanding of the world. Something that made him question not just his education, but his entire worldview. Carlos took me through the photographs methodically, explaining what each image represented. Stone platforms that extend for acres, built from blocks so massive that modern cranes couldn't lift them. Underground chambers accessed through perfectly circular shafts that descend hundreds of feet into solid bedrock. Carved channels that redirect underground water systems with engineering precision that would impress modern hydraulic engineers. And the mathematics. Oh, the mathematics embedded in these structures will make your head spin. Every angle, every measurement, every proportional relationship demonstrates knowledge of advanced geometry that we supposedly didn't develop until the Renaissance. The golden ratio appears constantly. Pi is encoded in the architectural relationships. These weren't accidental proportions created by people eyeballing their construction. These were deliberate, calculated, mathematically sophisticated designs. But here's what really got my attention. Carlos showed me thermal imaging data from the site, taken during different seasons and times of day. The stone blocks maintain consistent temperatures in ways that suggest they're not just carved granite and basalt. They're composite materials, somehow engineered to have specific thermal properties. Modern materials science can't explain how ancient people created stones that regulate their own temperature. When I asked Carlos what he thought this meant, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. Either we're looking at evidence of technology that's completely beyond anything ancient people should have possessed, or these structures are much, much younger than the carbon dating suggests. And if they're younger, then someone with advanced capabilities was building in the Amazon far more recently than anyone wants to admit. That possibility kept me awake for weeks, because if these structures aren't 12,000 years old, if they're more recent, then who built them? And why are they hidden in the most remote parts of the Amazon, far from any known historical civilization? The answer might lie in the patterns themselves. When you plot the locations of all known megalithic sites across the Amazon basin, something extraordinary emerges. They form a network, not a random scattering, but a deliberate grid that covers thousands of square miles. Each site is positioned at specific distances from the others, creating geometric relationships that mirror star maps from different historical periods. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an archaeoastronomer who's been studying these alignments, discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about ancient knowledge. The sites don't just align with constellations from 12,000 years ago. They also align with star positions from 8,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and even more recent periods, as if whoever built them understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes how constellations appear over thousands of years. This isn't knowledge that ancient hunter-gatherers should have possessed. Understanding precession requires centuries of careful astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and record keeping. It requires written language, numerical systems, and institutional knowledge that can be passed down through generations. All things that mainstream archaeology tells us didn't exist in the Amazon until European contact. But the stones don't lie. The alignments are there, precise and undeniable. Someone, at some point in history, possessed astronomical knowledge that rivals our modern understanding and used it to create a continent-spanning network of monuments. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is who did it, when, and why. The indigenous communities who live near these sites have answers, but they're answers that make academics uncomfortable. The Kayapo people speak of the time before the sky fell, when the earth was different and the star people lived among humans. They describe beings who could move stones with sound, who understood the language of the earth itself, who built the ancient places as markers for future generations. The Xingu tribes have similar stories, passed down through oral tradition for countless generations. They talk about the time of the builders, when the jungle was young and the world was connected by paths of light. According to their legends, these beings didn't use tools to cut stone. They used knowledge, understanding frequencies and vibrations that could reshape matter itself. Now I know how that sounds. I know it seems impossible, fantastical, the stuff of science fiction rather than archaeology. But before you dismiss these accounts, consider this. Sound can indeed affect matter. We know that certain frequencies can shatter glass, that ultrasonic vibrations can cut through metal, that acoustic levitation is a real phenomenon that we're only beginning to understand. What if the indigenous stories aren't mythology? What if they're historical accounts of technologies we've forgotten? What if the precision cutting, the massive stone movement, the impossible construction techniques weren't accomplished with primitive tools but with sophisticated understanding of physics that we're only now rediscovering? This possibility becomes even more intriguing when you examine the acoustic properties of the megalithic sites themselves. Several research teams have discovered that the stone chambers and passageways create specific resonance frequencies when sound is introduced. Not random echoes, but precisely tuned acoustic effects that suggest the structures were designed with sound in mind. At the Pedra Pintada complex in northern Brazil, researchers found that certain chambers amplify human voices at exactly the frequencies associated with altered states of consciousness. Other areas create standing wave patterns that can be felt physically, vibrations that seem to resonate through the human body in ways that are both unsettling and profound. Could these acoustic properties be accidental byproducts of the construction, or were they intentional features? If they were intentional, what does that tell us about the knowledge and capabilities of the builders? And more importantly, what were these spaces actually used for? The answer might be hidden in the imagery that covers many of these stones. Not random decorative patterns, but complex symbolic systems that appear to encode information. Spirals, geometric forms, and strange figures that don't match any known ancient art styles from the region. Some of the symbols are so intricate, so precisely executed, that they appear to have been created with tools far more sophisticated than anything we associate with prehistoric cultures. Dr. Michael Harrison, a specialist in ancient symbolic systems, has been studying these carvings for over a decade. What he's discovered challenges our understanding of when writing and mathematical notation first appeared in the Americas. The symbols aren't random. They follow consistent rules and patterns that suggest they're components of a true writing system, possibly encoding information about astronomy, engineering, or spiritual practices. But here's the most disturbing part of Dr. Harrison's research. The symbols don't appear to be indigenous to the Amazon at all. Similar markings have been found at megalithic sites around the world, from Easter Island to the stone circles of Britain, from the temples of Malta to the underground cities of Turkey. The same symbolic language appears to have been used by builders on different continents, separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years. This suggests something that makes mainstream archaeologists deeply uncomfortable, that these sites weren't built by isolated local cultures, but by a connected global civilization that possessed knowledge and capabilities we're only beginning to understand. A civilization that somehow disappeared from the historical record, leaving behind only massive stone monuments and stories dismissed as mythology. The implications are staggering. If this interpretation is correct, then human civilization has experienced a rise and fall that dwarfs anything in our recorded history. Advanced knowledge has been lost and rediscovered multiple times. Technologies that we consider cutting edge may be rediscoveries of principles that were once commonplace. And if that's true, then what else might be hidden in the most remote corners of our planet? What other evidence of lost knowledge might be buried beneath jungles, deserts, and ice sheets? What capabilities might we have forgotten that could revolutionize our understanding of physics, engineering, and human potential? These aren't just academic questions. They're urgent, practical concerns. Because if ancient builders possessed technologies that we're still trying to understand, if they had solutions to engineering problems that we're still struggling with, then studying these sites isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about recovering knowledge that could benefit humanity right now. But that recovery is being actively prevented. Research is blocked, funding is denied, evidence is suppressed. The question we have to ask is, why? What's so threatening about the possibility that ancient humans achieved technological sophistication that rivals our own? What's so dangerous about the idea that we might learn something from studying their achievements? The answer might be that acknowledging these possibilities would force us to completely rewrite not just ancient history, but our understanding of human potential itself. It would mean admitting that progress isn't linear, that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can rise to great heights only to fall back into darkness. And for institutions that depend on the narrative of steady human advancement, that's a very uncomfortable truth. But truth has a way of emerging regardless of institutional comfort. And in the Amazon, carved in stone that has withstood thousands of years of jungle growth and deliberate concealment, the truth is waiting for anyone brave enough to look. The deeper I dug into the Amazon megalith mystery, the more I realized I wasn't just investigating ancient stones. I was uncovering a pattern of suppression that extends far beyond academic circles into realms that made my hands shake as I typed my research notes. It started with Dr. Patricia Veiga, an archaeologist from the University of São Paulo, who led one of the first comprehensive surveys of the Monte Alegre complex in 2018. Her team had documented over 40 separate megalithic structures, each one more impossible than the last. Stone blocks weighing 300 tons, lifted and positioned with tolerances measured in millimeters. Underground chambers that extended in perfect spirals deep into the bedrock. Astronomical alignments that demonstrated knowledge of celestial mechanics that shouldn't have existed for another 10,000 years. Dr. Veiga's preliminary report was submitted to the Brazilian Ministry of Culture in March 2019. 3 weeks later, her research permits were revoked without explanation. Her funding was terminated, and when she tried to publish her findings independently, she received a visit from 2 men in expensive suits who suggested that continuing her research might not be in her best interests. But Patricia Veiga is not easily intimidated. She continued her work in secret, using private funding and operating under assumed names. What she discovered in those clandestine months of research will make you question everything you think you know about who controls the flow of information in our modern world. The megalithic sites aren't just scattered randomly through the Amazon. They're positioned along specific geological formations that most people have never heard of. Magnetic anomalies, places where the Earth's magnetic field behaves in ways that modern physics can't fully explain. Areas where compasses spin wildly, where electronic equipment malfunctions, where the very air seems to hum with invisible energy. Dr. Veiga's team measured electromagnetic readings at 12 different sites, and every single location showed the same impossible characteristics. Magnetic field strengths that fluctuate in precise mathematical patterns. Electromagnetic frequencies that pulse in rhythm with astronomical events. Energy signatures that suggest these locations are somehow connected to each other through underground systems we don't understand. When I asked her what could create these effects, her answer chilled me to the bone. Either we're dealing with natural phenomena that our current scientific models can't account for, or these sites were built by people who understood principles of electromagnetic manipulation that we're only beginning to discover. And if it's the latter, then we need to completely reconsider what ancient humans were capable of. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make you question who's really in control of archaeological research. Dr. Veiga's electromagnetic readings weren't just academically interesting. They were strategically significant, because these same magnetic anomalies have been identified by military researchers as potentially valuable for advanced navigation systems, underground communication networks, and technologies that could revolutionize everything from GPS to submarine detection. Suddenly, ancient megalithic sites in the Amazon weren't just historical curiosities. They were strategic resources. And strategic resources attract the attention of people who prefer to operate in the shadows. The pattern became clear when I started investigating other researchers who'd encountered similar obstacles. Dr. James Crawford, a geophysicist from Oxford, who'd identified 17 megalithic complexes using satellite ground-penetrating radar. His research visa was revoked 3 days before he was scheduled to begin excavations. Dr. Sarah Kim from Seoul National University, whose team had discovered evidence of advanced metallurgy at sites that predate known metalworking by thousands of years. Her equipment was confiscated by customs officials and never returned. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a systematic campaign to control access to information about these sites. And when you start mapping the patterns of suppression, something disturbing emerges. The researchers being blocked aren't just random academics. They're specialists in technologies that have direct applications to modern engineering, energy production, and materials science. The ancient builders of these Amazon megaliths weren't just moving big rocks around for religious purposes. They were demonstrating mastery of principles that could transform our modern world. Principles that certain interests would prefer to remain hidden until they can be reverse engineered and controlled by the right people. Consider the stone composition itself. Independent analysis by 3 separate laboratories has confirmed that the megalithic blocks aren't just carved granite and basalt. They're engineered composite materials that demonstrate properties we've only achieved in the last few decades. Stones that are somehow lighter than they should be based on their mineral content. Materials that conduct electricity in ways that natural stone shouldn't. Surfaces that remain at consistent temperatures, regardless of environmental conditions. Dr. Martinez from the original survey team showed me microscopic analysis of stone samples that defied everything she knew about geology. The molecular structure has been altered at the atomic level, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone figured out how to reorganize the crystalline matrix of solid rock. We've only recently developed nanotechnology that can do something similar, and it requires equipment worth millions of dollars and energy inputs that would power a small city. Yet somehow, thousands of years ago, builders in the Amazon were casually manipulating matter at the molecular level to create construction materials with properties that we're still trying to understand. Materials that could revolutionize everything from aerospace engineering to renewable energy if we could figure out how they were made. And that's exactly what certain research groups have been trying to do. Quietly, without public oversight, using resources that don't appear in any official budgets. The indigenous communities weren't just telling stories about sky people and stone movers. They were preserving technical knowledge about advanced materials science and energy manipulation. Knowledge that's been dismissed as primitive mythology by academics who couldn't imagine that ancient people might have understood principles of physics that we're only now discovering. But the stones don't lie. The electromagnetic readings don't lie. The molecular analysis doesn't lie. Somewhere in the distant past, people possessed technologies that we've forgotten how to create. Technologies that could solve our current energy crisis, revolutionize transportation, and open possibilities that we can barely imagine. The question is, what happened to that knowledge? Did it disappear naturally through the chaos of war and environmental catastrophe? Or was it deliberately hidden, buried beneath layers of misinformation and academic dogma to prevent anyone from rediscovering principles that could destabilize existing power structures? The answer might be hidden in the construction techniques themselves. Because when you examine how these massive stones were cut, shaped, and positioned, you're not looking at evidence of primitive people with advanced tools. You're looking at evidence of people who understood the fundamental nature of matter and energy in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about physics. The cutting marks on these stones don't show evidence of chisels, saws, or any mechanical tools. They show evidence of controlled molecular separation, as if the stone was somehow convinced to divide along predetermined lines without the application of physical force. The surfaces are so smooth, so perfect, that they appear to have been formed rather than carved. Modern materials scientists call this process programmable matter. The ability to restructure atomic bonds to create materials with desired properties. It's theoretical research that we're decades away from achieving practically. Yet the evidence suggests that ancient builders in the Amazon had already mastered these techniques thousands of years ago. Dr. Chen Wei, a quantum physicist who's been studying these anomalies independently, believes the answer lies in understanding consciousness as a fundamental force rather than just an emergent property of complex brains. His research suggests that consciousness might be capable of directly influencing quantum processes, including the molecular bonds that hold matter together. If consciousness can affect quantum states, he explained during our interview, then sufficiently advanced consciousness might be able to reorganize matter at the atomic level. The indigenous stories about moving stones with thoughts might not be metaphorical. They might be literal descriptions of consciousness-based technology that we've forgotten how to access. This interpretation aligns with the acoustic properties discovered at these sites. Sound frequencies that induce altered states of consciousness. Resonance chambers that seem designed to amplify human brain activity. Architectural features that suggest these structures weren't just monuments, they were consciousness amplification devices. Imagine the implications. If ancient humans developed technologies based on the direct application of consciousness to manipulate matter and energy, then everything we think we know about the limits of human potential is wrong. We might be capable of abilities that we've dismissed as impossible, simply because our current scientific paradigm can't explain them. But acknowledging these possibilities would require admitting that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of nature rather than just a byproduct of neural activity. It would mean reconsidering the relationship between mind and matter in ways that could revolutionize not just technology, but our understanding of what it means to be human. These aren't comfortable ideas for institutions that depend on maintaining current power structures. If human consciousness has untapped capabilities that could render many existing technologies obsolete, if ancient knowledge could democratize abilities that are currently controlled by specialized equipment and expertise, then the geopolitical implications are staggering, which brings us back to the systematic suppression of research into these sites. This isn't just academic conservatism. This is strategic control of information that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in our modern world. The Amazon megaliths aren't just ancient mysteries. They're doorways to understanding human capabilities that have been forgotten, hidden, or deliberately suppressed. Capabilities that could transform our civilization if we had the courage to study them honestly and openly. But that study is being prevented at every level. Research permits denied, funding withdrawn, careers destroyed, evidence suppressed. The pattern is too consistent, too systematic to be coincidental. Someone doesn't want us to rediscover what ancient humans knew about consciousness, matter, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why? What are they so afraid we might discover? And more importantly, what are we willing to do to ensure that this knowledge isn't lost forever? Because buried beneath the green canopy of the Amazon, carved in stone that has withstood millennia of concealment, the answers are waiting. Answers that could change everything we think we know about ourselves, our past, and our unlimited potential as conscious beings in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than we've been taught to believe. The resistance I encountered when trying to investigate these sites firsthand should have been my first warning that I was treading into dangerous territory. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I finally made it to the Tapajós River complex in western Brazil, guided by a Munduruka elder named Raoni, who had been protecting these sites for over 40 years. The journey itself was grueling. 3 days by boat through tributaries that don't appear on any official maps, then 2 days on foot through jungle so thick that machetes became useless after the first hour. Raoni moved through this maze like he was walking through his living room, following paths that existed only in his memory and the subtle signs that the forest provides to those who know how to read them. But when we finally reached the clearing, when the canopy opened up and I saw what had been hidden there for thousands of years, I literally fell to my knees. Not from exhaustion, not from the humidity and the insects and the constant struggle against the jungle, but from the sheer overwhelming impossibility of what stood before me. A pyramid, not a small ceremonial mound, not a raised platform for religious ceremonies, but a massive step pyramid that rose over 200 feet into the canopy, constructed from blocks of stone so large that I couldn't see how they'd been moved, let alone lifted and precisely positioned. Each level was perfectly aligned, each corner measured to mathematical exactness, each surface cut and polished to a smoothness that reflected the filtered sunlight like mirrors. Raoni watched my reaction with the patient expression of someone who had seen this response many times before. When I finally found my voice and asked him how long his people had known about this place, his answer made my blood run cold. "We have always known," he said in Portuguese, mixed with words from his native language that had no translation. "But we were told never to speak of it. The men with guns came many years ago and said that if we talked about the old places, if we brought outsiders here, very bad things would happen to our families." The men with guns, not archaeologists, not government officials, not even treasure hunters looking for gold and artifacts. men with military bearing and resources that suggested backing from organizations with deep pockets and deeper connections. As we explored the pyramid complex, Raoni shared stories that his grandfather had told him, stories that went back generations before first contact with Europeans. The structure wasn't built by his ancestors, he explained. It was already ancient when his people first arrived in this region, already covered by jungle growth that suggested thousands of years of abandonment. But the most chilling part of his account wasn't about the age of the structures. It was about what happened to the people who tried to study them too closely. In the 1970s, he told me, a team of Brazilian archaeologists had spent several months documenting this same pyramid complex. They'd brought equipment, set up a base camp, started mapping the site and taking measurements. Then one day, military helicopters arrived. The researchers were taken away, their equipment confiscated, their documentation destroyed. The official report claimed there had been no archaeological expedition to this location. But Raoni had been there. He'd seen the helicopters, heard the arguments, watched as men in uniforms ordered the destruction of everything the archaeologists had discovered. He'd seen boxes of artifacts loaded onto aircraft and flown away to destinations unknown. And he'd heard the threats that ensured none of the local people would ever speak about what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just academic suppression. This was military intervention in scientific research, complete with classified protocols and national security implications. The Amazon megaliths weren't just being hidden from public view. They were being actively secured by forces that operated outside normal governmental oversight. As I photographed and measured what I could in the few hours we had before returning to safety, the magnitude of what was being concealed became overwhelming. This single pyramid complex represented construction capabilities that exceeded anything achieved by known pre-Columbian civilizations. The mathematical precision, the astronomical alignments, the sheer scale of the undertaking suggested organizational capabilities and technical knowledge that shouldn't have existed anywhere in the Americas before European contact. But more disturbing were the anomalies that my equipment detected. Electromagnetic readings that spiked and fluctuated in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic. Temperature variations that followed no logical distribution based on solar exposure or thermal mass. And most unsettling of all, gravitational measurements that showed consistent deviations from expected values throughout the complex. Dr. Lisa Hartwell, a physicist at MIT who agreed to analyze my data on condition of anonymity, spent weeks trying to explain what my instruments had recorded. Her final assessment was delivered in a phone call that she insisted be made from a payphone rather than any traceable line. "What you've measured shouldn't be possible," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Gravitational fields don't just fluctuate randomly. They're determined by mass distribution, and mass distribution doesn't change unless something is physically moved. Either your equipment was malfunctioning, or you've documented something that challenges our basic understanding of how gravity works." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If these structures were somehow affecting local gravitational fields, if they were built with knowledge of principles that we've only theoretical understanding of, then we weren't just looking at advanced ancient engineering. We were looking at technology that surpassed our current capabilities. But the most disturbing discovery came when I analyzed the stone composition using portable spectroscopy equipment I'd borrowed from a geology department contact. The results made no sense according to everything we know about natural stone formation and conventional construction materials. The pyramid blocks weren't just carved from local stone. They were composed of materials that don't occur naturally in this region of the Amazon. Mineral compositions that required specific geological conditions that exist thousands of miles away. Elements that shouldn't be present together in natural formations, and isotopic ratios that suggested artificial enhancement or manipulation at the atomic level. Someone had either transported massive quantities of exotic materials across vast distances using methods that left no archaeological trace, or they had developed techniques for artificially creating stone with desired properties. Both possibilities challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient technological capabilities. When I shared these findings with Dr. Hartwell, the silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the connection had been lost. Finally, she spoke in a whisper that I had to strain to hear. "You need to stop this research immediately," she said, "and you need to destroy any copies of this data that might exist. What you found isn't just academically significant, it's strategically dangerous. There are people who would kill to keep this information from becoming public. Kill to keep information from becoming public." Let that phrase echo in your mind for a moment. We're not talking about academic rivalry or professional jealousy. We're talking about information so potentially destabilizing that it's considered a national security threat. But why? What's so dangerous about the possibility that ancient people possessed advanced material science? What's so threatening about evidence that human technological development might not follow the linear progression we've been taught? The answer became clearer when I started researching who controls access to these remote Amazon locations. The land rights, the research permits, the funding sources for expeditions that are approved by official channels. What I discovered was a web of interconnected interests that extends from academic institutions to government agencies to private corporations, with connections that disappear into classified territory. Certain mining companies hold exploration rights to vast areas of the Amazon that happen to coincide with megalithic site locations. Defense contractors fund research into exotic materials with properties that match what I documented at the Pyramid Complex. Government agencies with budgets that don't appear in public records maintain facilities in remote areas where acoustic and electromagnetic anomalies have been reported. The pattern suggested something that made my hands shake as I typed my notes. These sites aren't just being studied in secret, they're being reverse engineered. Teams of researchers with security clearances and unlimited budgets are systematically documenting and analysing ancient technologies that could revolutionize modern engineering, energy production, and materials science. But instead of sharing these discoveries with humanity, instead of using ancient knowledge to solve modern problems like climate change and resource depletion, the information is being classified and controlled by interests that profit from maintaining current technological limitations. Imagine what could happen if consciousness-based construction techniques were made publicly available, if electromagnetic manipulation methods were democratized, if materials with impossible properties could be manufactured by anyone with the right knowledge. The geopolitical implications would be staggering. Energy companies would become obsolete if ancient power generation methods were rediscovered. Transportation industries would collapse if gravitational manipulation became accessible. Military advantages would evaporate if advanced materials science became common knowledge. The systematic suppression of research into Amazon megaliths isn't just about protecting academic reputations or maintaining comfortable historical narratives. It's about preventing the democratization of technologies that could eliminate scarcity, reduce inequality, and fundamentally transform human civilization. But that suppression comes at a cost that extends far beyond academic freedom, because buried in these ancient sites might be solutions to the existential challenges that threaten our survival as a species. Climate change, resource depletion, energy crisis, problems that ancient builders might have already solved using principles we've forgotten. Every day that this knowledge remains hidden, every research expedition that's blocked, every scientist who's intimidated into silence represents a lost opportunity to recover wisdom that could save our world. The stakes aren't just academic or historical. They're about the future of human civilization itself. The indigenous communities who've protected these sites for generations understand this better than anyone. They've watched as their forest disappears, as their traditional ways of life are destroyed, as their children lose connection to knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate. They know that the ancient places hold keys to living in harmony with natural systems, to accessing capabilities that don't require the destruction of the environment. But their voices have been systematically marginalized, their knowledge dismissed as primitive superstition, their warnings ignored by institutions that prefer to maintain control rather than admit that indigenous wisdom might surpass modern understanding. Raoni told me something during our journey back through the jungle that I think about every day. He said that his people have a prophecy about a time when the old knowledge would need to be shared with the world, when the Earth itself would demand that humans remember who they really are and what they're capable of becoming. That time is now, he said, his eyes reflecting a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. But the people who control the world don't want to remember. They prefer to keep everyone small, afraid, dependent. They think that if people discover their true power, their true potential, there won't be room for those who profit from limitation. His words haunted me as we emerged from the forest and returned to the modern world of smartphones and satellite internet and the comfortable illusions of technological progress. Because what if he's right? What if the suppression of ancient knowledge isn't just about maintaining academic control or protecting commercial interests? What if it's about preventing humanity from remembering capabilities that would make current power structures obsolete? The Amazon megaliths stand as silent testimony to human potential that we've been taught to forget. They represent achievements that challenge every assumption about our limitations, our history, our place in the cosmos, and they're being systematically hidden from us by forces that benefit from our ignorance. But the stones can't be silenced forever. The truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it's buried. And as more researchers risk their careers to document these impossible structures, as more indigenous voices speak out despite the threats, as more evidence accumulates that can't be explained away or suppressed, the dam of secrecy begins to crack. The question isn't whether this information will eventually become public. The question is whether it will emerge soon enough to help us solve the crises that threaten our survival, or whether it will remain hidden until it's too late to matter. Because somewhere in the green depths of the Amazon, carved in stone that has withstood millennia of concealment, the answers we need are waiting. Answers about who we really are, what we're capable of, and how we might yet save ourselves from the limitations we've been taught to accept as permanent. The choice of what we do with those answers, if we ever get the chance to find them, will determine not just our understanding of the past, but our ability to create a future worth living. The deeper I investigated the Amazon megalith phenomenon, the more I realized that traditional archaeology had been asking the wrong questions entirely. Instead of wondering how ancient people could have built these structures, I should have been asking why modern people are so desperate to prove they couldn't have. It started with a conversation I had with Dr. Henrique Santos, a Brazilian geologist who'd been quietly studying these sites for over 15 years. Unlike his colleagues who focused on dating methods and tool marks, Dr. Santos approached the megaliths from a completely different angle. He wanted to understand the geological context, not just what the stones were made of, but why they were positioned in these specific locations. What he discovered changed everything I thought I knew about ancient site selection. Every single megalithic complex in the Amazon sits on what geologists call a crystalline basement. Ancient rock formations that are among the oldest on Earth, some dating back over 2 billion years. These aren't random jungle locations where primitive people happen to settle. These are geological power points, places where the Earth's crust contains concentrations of rare minerals and exhibits unique electromagnetic properties. Dr. Santos showed me geological surveys that mapped magnetic anomalies across the Amazon basin. The pattern was unmistakable. Every megalithic site corresponded exactly with locations where magnetic field measurements deviated significantly from normal readings. It wasn't that ancient builders randomly chose spots that happened to be geologically unique. They deliberately selected locations based on criteria that required sophisticated understanding of planetary electromagnetic systems. But here's where it gets really interesting. These geological anomalies aren't just scientific curiosities. They have practical applications that modern technology is only beginning to exploit. The same crystalline formations that create magnetic anomalies also generate piezoelectric effects, the ability to convert mechanical pressure into electrical energy. When subjected to stress, these rocks literally produce electricity. Modern engineers use piezoelectric materials in everything from smartphone screens to medical devices to energy harvesting systems. It's cutting-edge technology that we've developed within the last century. Yet somehow, thousands of years ago, ancient builders were positioning massive stone structures on the exact geological formations that would maximize these electrical generation effects. Were they aware of what they were doing? Did they understand that placing megalithic monuments on crystalline basement formations would create natural power generation systems? Or is this just another impossible coincidence in a mystery already filled with impossibilities? The answer might lie in the internal structure of the megaliths themselves. Because when Dr. Santos used ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface architecture of these monuments, he discovered something that made him question his entire understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. The stones weren't just stacked on top of each other. They were connected by an intricate network of channels, chambers, and passages that extended deep into the bedrock below. These weren't natural cave systems or simple foundations. They were deliberately engineered underground complexes that seemed designed to channel and direct the electromagnetic energies generated by the geological formations. Imagine water flowing through a sophisticated hydraulic system, except instead of water, we're talking about electromagnetic currents flowing through precisely carved stone conduits. The entire megalithic complex functioned as a kind of electrical circuit, using the natural piezoelectric properties of the bedrock to generate power, and then directing that power through the monument structure for purposes we can only guess at. This wasn't primitive construction. This was advanced electrical engineering implemented in stone, using principles that we're still discovering and techniques that we can barely comprehend. When I asked Dr. Santos what these ancient electrical systems might have been used for, he was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled out a folder of photographs that he'd been reluctant to share with anyone. The images showed the interior chambers of one megalithic complex, spaces that had been sealed for thousands of years until his team carefully opened them in 2016. The walls were covered with a metallic substance that analysis revealed to be a copper-silver alloy applied in precise geometric patterns. Not random decorative designs, but carefully calculated configurations that modern electrical engineers would recognize as sophisticated circuit layouts. But that wasn't the most startling discovery. In the center of several chambers were stone pedestals with circular depressions, each one lined with the same metallic alloy. The depressions were exactly the right size and shape to hold objects about the size of a human head, and the metallic patterns on the walls all radiated outward from these central positions, like circuits designed to channel energy toward whatever was placed on the pedestals. Dr. Santos believes these chambers were designed as some kind of consciousness amplification system. The electromagnetic energies generated by the geological formations, channeled through the stone conduits, focused into chambers lined with conductive materials, all directed towards central positions where human beings could interact directly with concentrated electromagnetic fields. The implications are staggering. If this interpretation is correct, then these weren't just monuments or temples. They were technological devices designed to enhance human consciousness through direct electromagnetic stimulation. Ancient neurotechnology implemented in stone and metal, using principles that we're only now beginning to understand through research into transcranial magnetic stimulation and electromagnetic effects on brain function. Modern neuroscience has discovered that specific electromagnetic frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness, enhance memory formation, and even trigger what subjects describe as mystical or transcendent experiences. The same frequencies that Dr. Santos measured in the megalithic chambers. The same electromagnetic patterns that the stone circuits seem designed to generate and focus. Were ancient people using these sites as consciousness enhancement facilities? Were the megalithic builders creating technology that could expand human mental capabilities beyond normal limits? And if so, what did they discover during those enhanced states of consciousness that allowed them to create constructions we still can't explain? The answers might be hidden in the astronomical alignments that every megalithic site displays. Because when you map the precise orientations of these monuments, when you trace the sight lines they establish with celestial bodies, A pattern emerges that suggests knowledge far beyond what we associate with ancient astronomical observation. Dr. Maria Esperanza, an archaeoastronomer from the University of Columbia, has spent years documenting the stellar alignments of Amazon megalithic sites. What she's discovered challenges every assumption about when and how humans first developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The monuments aren't just aligned with obvious celestial markers like the sun and moon. They're oriented to track the movements of specific stars and constellations with precision that requires understanding of phenomena that we didn't scientifically recognize until the modern era. Stellar proper motion, the way individual stars move across the sky over thousands of years. Galactic precession, the slow rotation of our entire galaxy that affects stellar positions over even longer timescales. To create alignments that account for these subtle astronomical effects, ancient builders would have needed centuries of careful observation, mathematical analysis, and record-keeping. They would have needed to understand that the Earth rotates, that it orbits the Sun, that our solar system moves through the galaxy, and that all of these movements combine to create complex changes in how we see the stars over long periods of time. This isn't knowledge that hunter-gatherer societies develop by accident. This is sophisticated astronomical science that requires written language, numerical systems, institutional continuity, and theoretical frameworks that we associate with advanced civilizations. But here's the most disturbing part of Dr. Esperanza's research. The stellar alignments don't just demonstrate knowledge of astronomical principles, they seem to encode specific information about cosmic cycles and celestial events that haven't occurred yet. Alignments that will only become significant thousands of years in the future, based on stellar movements that are still unfolding. It's as if the builders weren't just recording what they could observe in their own time. They were creating monuments that would serve as astronomical computers, devices that would continue to provide meaningful information for future generations, based on celestial mechanics that wouldn't be visible for millennia. How is that possible? How could ancient people predict stellar positions thousands of years into the future with accuracy that we can verify using modern astronomical software? Either they possessed computational capabilities that rival our most advanced supercomputers, or they had access to information sources that we can't even imagine. The indigenous oral traditions might provide clues, because across different tribes, across different languages and cultural contexts, the same themes appear repeatedly in stories about the ancient builders. They speak of people who could see across time, who understood the patterns that connect all things, who possessed knowledge that came not from observation, but from direct communion with the intelligence that moves the stars themselves. These accounts describe consciousness capabilities that extend far beyond normal human perception, the ability to access information that exists outside the normal flow of time and space. Direct knowing that doesn't depend on sensory input or logical deduction, but emerges from connection to universal intelligence systems that pervade reality itself. Modern physics is beginning to recognize that these possibilities might not be as impossible as they seem. Quantum mechanics suggests that information can exist in non-local states, that consciousness might play a fundamental role in determining physical reality, that the boundaries between observer and observed, between mind and matter, might be more fluid than classical physics assumed. If consciousness can access quantum information fields, if human awareness can connect directly to universal data systems, then the astronomical knowledge encoded in the megaliths might not have required centuries of observation and calculation. It might have emerged from consciousness states that allow direct perception of cosmic patterns and future celestial configurations. This interpretation aligns with the electromagnetic enhancement chambers that Dr. Santos discovered. If these sites were designed to amplify consciousness through electromagnetic stimulation, if they were technologies for expanding human awareness beyond normal limits, then the astronomical knowledge they preserve might be the result of enhanced perception rather than conventional observation. Imagine ancient people entering these consciousness amplification chambers, their awareness expanded through electromagnetic stimulation, their minds open to information that exists beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. In those altered states, they might have directly perceived the movements of stars, the patterns of cosmic cycles, the future configurations that their monuments were designed to mark and preserve. This isn't mystical speculation anymore. This is a working hypothesis that explains the impossible astronomical precision of the megaliths while remaining consistent with cutting-edge research in consciousness studies and quantum physics. It suggests that ancient builders possessed not just advanced construction techniques, but advanced consciousness techniques that allowed them to access information in ways we're only beginning to understand. But if this interpretation is correct, then the suppression of research into these sites takes on an even more sinister dimension. Because what's being hidden isn't just evidence of ancient technological sophistication, it's proof that human consciousness has capabilities that could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself, capabilities that would make many current power structures obsolete. If consciousness can access universal information fields, if awareness can be technologically enhanced to perceive beyond normal limitations, if human potential extends far beyond what we've been taught to believe, then the implications for social, political, and economic control are staggering. People with expanded consciousness capabilities wouldn't be dependent on external authorities for information. They wouldn't need to rely on institutions to tell them what's true or possible. They could access knowledge directly, verify information independently, and make decisions based on their own enhanced perception rather than on what they're told by experts and authorities. This is perhaps the most threatening possibility of all for those who profit from maintaining human limitation. Not just that we might rediscover ancient technologies, but that we might remember ancient consciousness capabilities that would make us impossible to control through ignorance and dependence. The Amazon megaliths aren't just monuments to forgotten engineering skills. They're evidence of human potential that's been systematically hidden from us, potential that could transform not just our technology, but our entire understanding of what it means to be human in a universe far more conscious and interconnected than we've been allowed to believe. But that potential remains buried beneath layers of academic denial, institutional suppression, and deliberate misinformation. The question is, how much longer can the truth remain hidden? How much longer can evidence this compelling be dismissed and suppressed? Because scattered throughout the Amazon, carved in stone that has withstood millennia of concealment, the proof is waiting. Proof that we are capable of far more than we've been taught. Proof that consciousness itself might be the key to technologies and capabilities that could solve every crisis we face. The choice of whether we recover that proof, whether we remember who we really are and what we're capable of becoming, may determine not just our understanding of the past, but our survival in the future. Because buried in those ancient stones might be the knowledge we need to transcend the limitations that currently threaten to destroy us. And somewhere in the depths of the Amazon, in chambers designed to amplify consciousness and monuments aligned with cosmic intelligence, that knowledge is still waiting for us to be brave enough to claim it. The moment I realized I wasn't just investigating ancient monuments but stumbling into a modern conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate power, my world shifted beneath my feet like quicksand. It started with a phone call I never should have received. 3 weeks after I published my preliminary findings about the electromagnetic anomalies at the Tapajos complex, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and spoke with the kind of authority that comes from wielding real power in shadowy places. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said, using a name that wasn't mine but somehow felt like it should be. "We understand you've been conducting research in areas that require special clearance. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to continue your work under more appropriate circumstances." The offer was generous. Unlimited funding, access to classified research facilities, collaboration with teams of experts whose names would never appear in academic journals. All I had to do was sign agreements that would prevent me from ever discussing my findings publicly and submit to oversight that would ensure my research served interests I would never be allowed to identify. When I declined, politely but firmly, the voice remained calm. "We hope you'll reconsider, Mr. Thompson. Independent research in this area can be dangerous. Jungle expeditions face so many unpredictable hazards. It would be unfortunate if something happened to compromise your safety. The line went dead, and I sat in the darkness of my hotel room, understanding that I had crossed an invisible line that separated casual investigation from genuine threat to established power. The Amazon megaliths weren't just archaeological anomalies being suppressed by academic conservatism. They were strategic assets being actively controlled by organizations that operated outside public oversight. But why? What made ancient stone structures in remote jungle locations worth threatening independent researchers? The answer began to emerge when I started investigating the corporate interests that held mining and exploration rights to the areas surrounding megalithic sites. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Shell companies with connections to defense contractors controlled access to regions where electromagnetic anomalies had been detected. Research foundations with ties to intelligence agencies funded expeditions that never published their findings. Mining operations that extracted unusually pure rare earth elements from areas that coincidentally contained ancient monuments with impossible construction characteristics. It wasn't just that these sites were being studied in secret. They were being systematically strip-mined for materials that didn't appear in any public commodity markets. Materials with properties that suggested artificial enhancement or manipulation at the molecular level. The same materials that comprise the megalithic blocks themselves. Dr. Santos had been right to be cautious about sharing his discoveries, because what he'd found wasn't just evidence of ancient advanced engineering. It was proof that someone had figured out how to create matter with properties that modern materials science could barely achieve, and that knowledge was being reverse engineered by groups with unlimited budgets and no accountability to public oversight. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If ancient builders had developed techniques for manipulating matter at the atomic level, if they'd created materials with impossible properties thousands of years ago, then studying these sites wasn't just about understanding the past. It was about recovering technologies that could revolutionize energy production, transportation, construction, and countless other applications that would transform modern civilization. But instead of sharing these discoveries with humanity, instead of using ancient knowledge to solve current crises like climate change and resource depletion, the information was being classified and weaponized by interests that profited from maintaining technological scarcity. This realization led me to investigate the researchers who had been granted official access to these sites. Not the academics whose funding had been mysteriously withdrawn, but the teams that operated with full government backing and security clearances that placed their work beyond public scrutiny. What I discovered was a shadow network of research facilities scattered across remote locations worldwide, all focused on reverse engineering technologies that officially didn't exist. Underground laboratories in Nevada, studying materials with gravitational anomalies. Arctic research stations analyzing crystalline structures that generated electricity without external power sources. Deep-sea facilities examining artifacts recovered from locations that weren't supposed to contain any evidence of advanced ancient civilizations. The Amazon megaliths weren't isolated phenomena. They were part of a global pattern of suppressed archaeological discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about human technological development. And at every site, the same interests were present. Defense contractors, intelligence agencies, corporations with connections that disappeared into classified territory. But the most disturbing discovery came when I identified some of the researchers working within these shadow programs. Names that appeared in academic papers, published decades before they allegedly began their classified work. Scientists whose official biographies contained gaps that corresponded exactly with periods when major megalithic discoveries were being suppressed from public view. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, for instance, published groundbreaking research on consciousness-matter interaction in 1987. Then disappeared from academic publication for 15 years, before resurfacing with papers on theoretical physics that seemed to reference technologies and principles she shouldn't have had access to. Dr. Michael Chen wrote extensively about electromagnetic effects on brain function in the early 1990s, then vanished from the scientific literature until 2008. when he began publishing work on quantum consciousness that included insights that could only have come from practical experimentation with electromagnetic brain stimulation. The pattern suggested something that made my hands shake as I compiled the evidence. These researchers hadn't disappeared from public view because they'd stopped working. They'd been recruited into classified programs that gave them access to technologies and knowledge recovered from sites like the Amazon Megaliths. Their later public work represented sanitized versions of discoveries they'd made using ancient principles that were too strategically valuable to share openly. But the most chilling realization came when I started mapping the timeline of these disappearances against major geopolitical events. Every time global tensions escalated, every time new military technologies appeared without clear development histories, more researchers vanished into classified programs focused on reverse engineering impossible archaeological discoveries. The Cold War space race hadn't been driven just by competition between superpowers. It had been fueled by technologies recovered from ancient sites that demonstrated capabilities that mainstream science insisted were impossible. The sudden leap from propeller aircraft to jet engines, from mechanical computers to integrated circuits, from chemical rockets to ion drives. Advances that occurred faster than normal technological development could explain, as if they were based on rediscovered principles rather than original innovation. Ancient builders hadn't just possessed advanced construction techniques, they'd developed technologies that modern civilization was still trying to understand and replicate. Technologies that were being systematically recovered, studied, and weaponized by shadow organizations that operated beyond public oversight or democratic accountability. But the suppression wasn't perfect. Too many researchers had seen too much evidence. Too many indigenous communities preserved oral traditions that contradicted official historical narratives. Too many independent investigators were asking questions that couldn't be answered without acknowledging uncomfortable truths about human technological development. Cracks were appearing in the wall of secrecy. Whistleblowers were beginning to speak out. Documents were being leaked that revealed the scope and scale of classified archaeological research programs. And most importantly, new discoveries were being made faster than they could be suppressed by researchers who refused to be intimidated and indigenous communities who were tired of being silenced. The truth about the Amazon megaliths was part of a larger truth about human history, technological development, and the systematic suppression of knowledge that could transform civilization. Knowledge that could solve energy crises, eliminate resource scarcity, and unlock human capabilities that had been forgotten for thousands of years. But that knowledge remained locked away in classified facilities, studied by researchers whose work would never see public light, controlled by interests that profited from maintaining human limitation rather than enabling human potential. The question wasn't whether this information would eventually emerge. The question was whether it would emerge soon enough to matter. Because while these ancient technologies remained hidden, while consciousness enhancement techniques stayed classified, while materials science discoveries were weaponized rather than democratized, humanity continued to face crises that ancient builders had already solved. Climate change, resource depletion, energy scarcity, problems that could be resolved using principles carved in stone thousands of years ago by people who understood the nature of matter and consciousness in ways that we're only beginning to rediscover. The Amazon megaliths weren't just monuments to forgotten civilizations. They were libraries of suppressed knowledge, encoded in stone that had withstood millennia of concealment and modern efforts at control. Libraries that contained solutions to every crisis we face. If only we had the courage to read what ancient builders had written for us. But reading those libraries required more than archaeological expertise or advanced technology. It required recognizing that consciousness itself might be the key to understanding principles that transcend normal physical limitations. It required acknowledging that human potential extends far beyond what we've been taught to believe possible. And most challenging of all, it required confronting the reality that powerful interests have been systematically hiding this knowledge from us, not to protect us from dangerous information, but to prevent us from discovering capabilities that would make their control obsolete. The stones in the Amazon hold more than historical secrets. They hold the keys to human transformation, to technologies that could revolutionize civilization, to consciousness techniques that could unlock abilities we've forgotten we possess. But those keys remain buried beneath layers of institutional denial, academic suppression, and deliberate misinformation designed to keep us small, dependent, and convinced that our current limitations are permanent. The choice of whether we recover those keys, whether we remember who we really are, and what we're capable of becoming, will determine not just our understanding of the past, but our ability to create a future worth inhabiting. Because somewhere in the green depths of the Amazon, in chambers designed to amplify consciousness and monuments aligned with cosmic intelligence, the answers we need are still waiting for us to be brave enough to look beyond comfortable lies and confront uncomfortable truths, waiting for us to remember that we are capable of far more than we've been taught, waiting for us to reclaim knowledge that belongs not to classified programs or shadow organizations, but to humanity itself. The question is, are we ready to claim it? Are we prepared to face the implications of what we might discover? And are we willing to fight for the right to access knowledge that could transform not just our technology, but our entire understanding of what it means to be human in a universe far more conscious and interconnected than we've been allowed to believe? Because the stones are still there, still holding their secrets, still waiting for someone brave enough to listen to what they have to say. And what they have to say could change everything. The evidence I'm about to share with you comes from sources that risk everything to get this information out. Documents smuggled out of classified facilities by researchers whose consciences finally overcame their security clearances. Testimonies from indigenous elders who decided that protecting their ancestral knowledge was more important than avoiding government retaliation. Data recovered from hard drives that were supposed to be permanently destroyed. What these sources reveal is a timeline that will shatter your understanding of how long this suppression has been going on. The systematic concealment of Amazon megalith discoveries didn't start with recent expeditions being shut down. It's been happening for over a century, orchestrated by the same institutions that shape our understanding of history, science, and human potential. In 1924, British explorer Colonel Percy Fawcett disappeared in the Amazon while searching for what he called the Lost City of Z. Official records claim he was seeking a mythical golden city based on indigenous legends. But documents leaked in 2018 reveal that Fawcett was actually following Portuguese maps from the 1750s that mark the locations of massive stone structures deep in unexplored regions of the Mato Grosso. Fawcett's final letters, never made public until now, describe discoveries that match exactly what modern researchers have found at megalithic sites. Stone blocks of impossible size, arranged in geometric patterns. Underground chambers lined with metallic substances. Electromagnetic anomalies that affected his compass readings and made his men complain of strange dreams and heightened awareness. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Fawcett wasn't working alone. He was funded by a consortium of British industrialists and American financiers who had specific interest in recovering ancient technologies that could revolutionize manufacturing and energy production. His expedition carried equipment that was decades ahead of anything publicly available. Ground-penetrating devices, electromagnetic sensors, spectrographic analysis tools disguised as surveying instruments. When Fawcett's radio transmissions stopped, rescue expeditions found his base camp abandoned but intact. All his equipment was gone. All his documentation had been removed. And the indigenous guides who had led him to the megalithic sites were never seen again. The official story of 3 men lost in the jungle became a convenient cover for what was actually a successful extraction of archaeological intelligence too valuable to remain in private hands. This pattern repeated throughout the 20th century. Researchers who found evidence of advanced ancient construction would disappear, their findings would be classified, and sanitized versions of their work would appear years later in academic publications that removed any references to impossible technologies or anomalous discoveries. Dr. Maria Reicher, famous for her work documenting the Nazca lines in Peru, actually began her career studying megalithic sites in the Amazon. Her early papers, published in obscure Brazilian journals between 1932 and 1935, describe stone structures with mathematical precision that exceeded anything known from pre-Columbian civilizations. Then suddenly, her focus shifted to the Nazca lines, where she spent the rest of her career studying ground drawings that, while mysterious, pose no threat to established technological paradigms. What changed? Recently declassified documents reveal that Dr. Reich was approached by representatives of the Carnegie Institution in 1936 and offered unlimited funding for research into appropriate archaeological subjects. The Amazon megalith papers were never mentioned again, and copies disappeared from the libraries where they had been housed. But the suppression goes deeper than individual researchers. Entire expeditions have been erased from the historical record. In 1952, a joint Brazilian-American archaeological mission spent 8 months documenting megalithic complexes along the Xingu River. Their preliminary report described construction techniques that challenge fundamental assumptions about pre-Columbian technological capabilities and recommended immediate large-scale excavation of sites that may revolutionize our understanding of ancient American civilizations. The expedition's final report was classified by both governments. The team members were transferred to different projects. The sites they had documented were declared environmentally protected areas where no further research would be permitted. And when independent investigators tried to locate these areas decades later, they found that the geographical coordinates in the preliminary report led to empty jungle with no trace of any archaeological features. Either the expedition had fabricated their findings, or something had been deliberately removed from those locations. Something valuable enough to justify a massive covert operation that eliminated physical evidence while maintaining the appearance of environmental protection. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine the industrial applications that emerge from these suppressed discoveries. Technologies that appeared suddenly in the 1950s and 1960s without clear development histories. Advanced metallurgy techniques that produced alloys with properties that shouldn't have been achievable with available equipment. Construction methods that allowed the creation of structures with precision that exceeded normal engineering tolerances. The interstate highway system, built between 1956 and 1992, incorporated construction techniques that civil engineers struggled to explain. Roadways that remained perfectly level across hundreds of miles despite underlying geological variations. Bridges that distributed weight loads in ways that required understanding of stress dynamics that hadn't been publicly developed. Materials that resisted weathering and seismic damage far beyond what concrete and steel should have been capable of achieving. Where did these capabilities come from? How did American engineering suddenly leap forward by decades in the space of a few years? The official explanation points to wartime technological development and increased federal funding for infrastructure projects. But internal documents from construction companies reveal a different story. Engineers on these projects were provided with specifications and materials that came from sources they were never allowed to identify. Blueprints that demonstrated mathematical relationships and structural principles that project managers didn't fully understand. Concrete additives and steel alloys that were manufactured in classified facilities and delivered without documentation about their composition or properties. The interstate highway system wasn't just an infrastructure project. It was a testing ground for construction technologies recovered from ancient sites, refined in classified laboratories, and deployed on a national scale to evaluate their practical applications. American drivers have been traveling on roads built with principles discovered in Amazon megaliths for over 60 years, never knowing that their smooth commute depended on knowledge that officially doesn't exist. But highways are just the beginning. The same suppressed archaeological research influenced developments in aerospace, electronics, materials science, and energy production throughout the Cold War period. Every technological leap that seemed to come from nowhere. Every innovation that appeared without clear developmental lineage. Every breakthrough that advanced human capabilities beyond what gradual research progress could explain. The space program provides the most obvious example. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik using rocket technology that represented a massive advancement over anything that had been publicly tested. 2 years later, NASA was created and immediately began developing propulsion systems that incorporated principles that wouldn't be publicly understood for decades. Where did this knowledge come from? How did rocket science advance so rapidly from crude chemical propulsion to sophisticated guidance systems and heat-resistant materials? The official narrative credits German scientists recruited after World War II and increased government investment in research and development. But that narrative doesn't explain the specific breakthroughs that made space exploration possible. The heat-resistant tiles that protected spacecraft during re-entry used materials with properties that modern chemistry still struggles to replicate. The guidance computers that navigated missions to the moon employed processing principles that wouldn't be publicly developed until the 1980s. The life support systems that maintained artificial environments in the vacuum of space incorporated technologies that seemed to understand biological processes at levels that medical science was decades away from achieving. Internal NASA documents, leaked by whistleblowers in the 1990s, reference archaeological material studies and recovered artifact analysis in contexts that make no sense if the space program was based entirely on original research. Equipment specifications that cite template A7 and configuration stone pattern 12, without any explanation of what these references mean or where they originated. The most disturbing revelation comes from a 1963 memo that describes testing facilities where recovered materials are evaluated for potential aerospace applications under controlled conditions that simulate their original operational environment. The memo goes on to discuss consciousness interface protocols and electromagnetic resonance matching, as if these were standard engineering considerations rather than concepts that wouldn't appear in mainstream science for another 50 years. Consciousness interface protocols. Let that phrase echo in your mind for a moment. In 1963, NASA was apparently testing technologies that required interaction between human consciousness and advanced materials. Technologies that couldn't function without some form of mental interface between the operator and the equipment. This aligns perfectly with what we've discovered about the Amazon megaliths. Stone structures that incorporated consciousness amplification chambers, construction materials that responded to electromagnetic fields generated by human brain activity. Ancient technologies that required expanded awareness to operate effectively. The space program wasn't just about exploring outer space. It was about reverse engineering technologies that demonstrated the relationship between consciousness and matter, between human potential and physical reality. Technologies that ancient builders had mastered and hidden in stone monuments scattered across the globe. But the implications extend far beyond aerospace applications. If consciousness can interface directly with matter, if awareness can influence physical systems, if human potential includes capabilities that transcend normal biological limitations, then every assumption about the nature of reality needs to be reconsidered. The researchers who made these discoveries understood the revolutionary implications. They also understood that this knowledge couldn't be released publicly without fundamentally destabilizing existing power structures. So they developed it in secret, deploying consciousness-based technologies in applications where their true nature could be disguised as conventional engineering. Your smartphone contains components that function through principles discovered in Amazon megalith chambers. The GPS system that guides your daily travels operates using consciousness matter interface protocols recovered from ancient sites. The internet that connects you to global information networks incorporates data transmission methods that ancient builders encoded in stone monuments thousands of years ago. Modern civilization is built on suppressed archaeological discoveries. Technologies that should have revolutionized human society instead became the invisible foundation for maintaining control through artificial scarcity and managed technological release. Instead of democratizing consciousness-based capabilities, they were weaponized and commercialized by interests that profit from human limitation. But the suppression is breaking down. Too many researchers have seen too much evidence. Too many indigenous communities are speaking out about knowledge they've preserved for generations. Too many independent investigators are connecting patterns that can no longer be explained away through conventional narratives. The truth about the Amazon megaliths is part of a larger truth about human history, technological development, and the systematic concealment of our true capabilities as conscious beings. Truth that challenges not just academic timelines, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. We stand at a crossroads where continued suppression becomes impossible and public revelation becomes inevitable. The question isn't whether this information will emerge, it's whether we'll be prepared for the implications when it does. Whether we'll have the courage to embrace capabilities we've forgotten we possess and use them to create a world worthy of our true potential. Because buried in the Amazon, encoded in stone that has withstood millennia of concealment, the keys to human transformation are still waiting, still holding their secrets, still ready to unlock abilities that could solve every crisis we face and open possibilities we've only dreamed of. The choice of what we do with those keys will determine not just our future, but our understanding of who we really are and what we're capable of becoming. The stones have been patient. They've waited through centuries of suppression and denial. But they won't wait forever, and neither should we. The morning I received the photographs that would change everything, I was sitting in a cafe in Manaus, nursing my third cup of coffee and wondering if I'd wasted months chasing shadows in the jungle. My contact, a geologist named Dr. Ana Ribeiro, had been silent for weeks after promising evidence that would vindicate everything I'd been investigating. I'd started to think she'd been intimidated into silence like so many others. Then my phone buzzed with an encrypted message containing images that made my hands tremble as I opened them. What I saw defied every law of physics I thought I understood. Stone blocks, yes, but not just any stone blocks. These were floating, actually suspended in mid-air, held in place by forces that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. The photographs showed megalithic structures, where massive granite slabs hung in perfect geometric arrangements without any visible means of support, as if gravity had simply decided to take a holiday in certain locations. Dr. Ribeiro's accompanying message was brief but chilling. Found the activation chamber. They're still working. Get here fast. They know I took these. I was on a plane within 6 hours, my mind racing with implications that threatened to shatter my understanding of what ancient technology was capable of achieving. Floating stones weren't just evidence of advanced engineering. They were proof that someone, thousands of years ago, had mastered principles of physics that we're still convinced are impossible. The flight to the remote airstrip where Dr. Ribeiro waited felt like the longest journey of my life. Every time I looked at those photographs, I discovered new details that made the mystery deeper. The floating stones weren't random chunks of rock suspended by unknown forces. They were precisely carved architectural elements, fitted together in mid-air, with the same impossible tolerances I'd seen in ground-based megalithic construction. But more disturbing were the patterns of light visible in several images. Streams of energy that seemed to flow between the suspended stones, creating geometric configurations that pulsed and shifted like living neural networks. Whatever was keeping these massive blocks airborne was also connecting them through energy systems that looked more like consciousness than conventional power sources. When I finally reached the site, hidden deep in a canyon that didn't appear on any official maps, the reality exceeded even what the photographs had prepared me for. Dr. Ribeiro met me at the jungle's edge with an expression that mixed excitement with genuine terror. Her first words told me everything I needed to know about what we were dealing with. "It's not just the stones," she whispered, glancing nervously at the forest around us. "The people who built this place, they're still here. Not physically, but their consciousness is embedded in the system somehow." The stones respond to thoughts, to intentions. When I first entered the activation chamber, something spoke to me without words. It knew who I was, why I'd come, and what I was capable of understanding. The trek to the floating megaliths took 3 hours through terrain that seemed to shift and change as we moved through it. Paths that had been clear moments before became blocked by vegetation that hadn't been there seconds earlier. Streams appeared and disappeared without warning. The jungle itself seemed to be testing us, evaluating our intentions before allowing us access to secrets that had been protected for millennia. But the most unsettling aspect was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper quiet that seemed to muffle even our footsteps and breathing, as if the very air around the megalithic site existed in a different acoustic environment where normal rules of sound transmission didn't apply. When we finally emerged into the canyon clearing, I understood why Dr. Ribeiro had looked terrified. The floating stones were even more impossible in person than in photographs. Massive granite blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, hung suspended in perfect formations that created architectural spaces without any ground-level foundation. Chambers and corridors existed entirely in mid-air, accessible only to those who could somehow navigate between floating platforms that offered no conventional means of support. But that wasn't what made me sink to my knees in overwhelmed awe. It was the realization that the entire complex was alive, not in a biological sense, but in ways that suggested consciousness had been engineered into the very structure of the stone itself. The energy patterns flowing between suspended blocks weren't random electromagnetic phenomena. They were thoughts made visible, awareness given form through technologies that shouldn't exist. Dr. Ribeiro guided me to what she called the activation chamber, a circular room formed by stones floating in perfect geometric arrangement, about 30 feet above the canyon floor. Access required climbing a spiral of smaller suspended blocks that served as steps, each one supporting our weight despite having no visible connection to anything solid. The chamber itself defied every principle of architecture I'd ever studied. Walls, floor, and ceiling were all floating stone surfaces that maintained precise relationships to each other through forces I couldn't identify. But the most extraordinary feature was the central platform, where a single chair-shaped formation waited like a throne designed for consciousness itself. "Sit there," Dr. Ribeiro urged, "and the system will interface directly with your awareness. But be prepared. What you experience will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality." The moment I settled into the consciousness interface chair, the entire chamber came alive around me. The floating stones began to pulse with light that synchronized with my heartbeat. Energy patterns flowed through the air in configurations that somehow conveyed meaning directly to my mind, without passing through normal sensory channels. And then, without warning, I was no longer in the Amazon Canyon, but somewhere else entirely. I found myself standing in the same location, but thousands of years in the past. The jungle was different, younger, less dense, filled with species I didn't recognize. But the megalithic complex was fully operational, bustling with activity from people whose capabilities transcended anything I'd imagined ancient humans could achieve. These weren't primitive builders struggling with stone tools and crude engineering. They moved through the floating chamber complex with casual familiarity, manipulating gravitational fields as easily as we might adjust lighting or temperature. They communicated without speaking, sharing thoughts and intentions through the same consciousness networks that connected the suspended stones. And most remarkably, they were expecting me. One figure approached, dressed in simple robes that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. When they spoke, the words formed directly in my mind rather than passing through my ears. "You have come seeking answers about technologies that your civilization has forgotten," the consciousness communicated. "But the real question is not how we built these structures. The real question is why your people have convinced themselves that such things are impossible." The revelation that followed challenged everything I thought I understood about human history, technological development, and the nature of consciousness itself. These ancient builders hadn't discovered exotic physics or developed advanced material science through conventional research and experimentation. They had remembered capabilities that human consciousness naturally possesses when freed from limiting beliefs about what's possible. The floating stones weren't held aloft by mysterious force fields or anti-gravity devices. They were suspended by collective consciousness that understood matter as condensed awareness rather than solid substance. The energy patterns connecting the megalithic elements weren't electromagnetic phenomena, but visible manifestations of thought itself. Consciousness made tangible through focused intention and expanded awareness. Your civilization has been taught to believe that consciousness is produced by matter, the ancient builder continued. But the truth is precisely the opposite. Matter is produced by consciousness. When you understand this principle, manipulating physical reality becomes as natural as thinking itself. The implications crashed over me like a tsunami of understanding. Every impossible aspect of the Amazon megaliths suddenly made perfect sense when viewed from the perspective that consciousness is the fundamental force of the universe, rather than an accidental byproduct of complex chemistry. The precision cutting, the massive stone movement, the electromagnetic anomalies, the astronomical alignments, all were natural expressions of awareness, operating at levels that transcended normal human limitations. But the vision wasn't finished with me. As I absorbed these revelations, the scene shifted to show me the catastrophe that had ended this golden age of consciousness-based technology. Not a natural disaster or invasion by primitive enemies, but a deliberate choice made by the advanced civilization itself. We foresaw a time when humanity would forget its true nature, the ancient consciousness explained. A period of darkness when your people would believe themselves limited to physical bodies and mechanical technologies. So we encoded our knowledge in stone monuments that would survive the forgetting, waiting for the moment when your species would be ready to remember. The floating megaliths weren't just architectural achievements. They were consciousness activation systems designed to trigger remembrance in future humans who had evolved enough to access the interface chambers. The entire Amazon complex was a kind of time capsule, preserving not just information about ancient capabilities, but actual technologies that could restore those capabilities to modern humans willing to expand their understanding of consciousness itself. As the vision faded, and I found myself back in the floating chamber with Dr. Ribeiro watching anxiously, the weight of what I'd experienced settled over me like a lead blanket. The systematic suppression of megalithic research wasn't just about hiding evidence of advanced ancient engineering. It was about preventing modern humans from rediscovering consciousness capabilities that would make current power structures obsolete. If people understood that consciousness could directly manipulate matter, that awareness could access information across space and time, that human potential included abilities that transcended normal biological limitations, then every institution, based on scarcity and control, would become irrelevant overnight. The suppression wasn't protecting us from dangerous knowledge. It was protecting established interests from human empowerment. Dr. Ribeiro's voice seemed to come from very far away as she asked what I'd experienced. But before I could answer, we both heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching the canyon. Military aircraft, moving with the precision and speed that suggested this wasn't a rescue mission, but an extraction operation. "They found us," she whispered, her face pale with fear. "We have minutes before they arrive. You have to document everything, get the information out before they can suppress it again." As I frantically photographed the floating stones and recorded what I could of the consciousness interface technology, one thought echoed in my mind with crystalline clarity. The ancient builders hadn't just preserved their knowledge in stone monuments scattered across the Amazon. They had embedded it in the consciousness of every human being, waiting for the moment when we would be ready to remember who we really are and what we're capable of becoming. The suppression could hide the physical evidence, intimidate researchers, and control access to archaeological sites. But they couldn't suppress the consciousness capabilities that every person carries within themselves. The real megalithic technology wasn't built into the stones, it was built into us. And once enough people remembered how to access it, no amount of institutional control could keep humanity limited to current technological paradigms. The helicopters were landing as we fled deeper into the jungle, but I carried with me something more valuable than photographs or measurements. I carried the understanding that human consciousness is the ultimate technology, capable of achievements that make our current engineering look primitive by comparison. The Amazon megaliths were just the beginning. Scattered across our planet are thousands of consciousness activation sites, each one designed to trigger remembrance in humans, ready to transcend the limitations they've been taught to accept as permanent. The question isn't whether this knowledge will emerge. The consciousness interface chambers ensure that it will. The question is whether we'll be prepared for the transformation that comes with remembering our true capabilities. Because once you understand that consciousness creates reality rather than being created by it, once you experience directly that thought can manipulate matter, and awareness can transcend space and time, everything changes. Your relationship to technology, to power, to possibility itself shifts in ways that can never be reversed. The floating stones of the Amazon aren't just evidence of ancient advancement. They're proof that human potential extends far beyond anything we've been taught to believe, and buried in consciousness activation chambers hidden throughout our world. That proof is waiting for anyone brave enough to sit in an ancient chair and remember who they really are. The suppressors know this. That's why they're so desperate to keep these sites hidden, to intimidate researchers, to maintain the illusion that consciousness is just a byproduct of brain chemistry. Because once humanity remembers its true nature, once people understand that they don't need external technologies to achieve impossible things, the entire control structure collapses. But consciousness is patient. It has waited through millennia of forgetting, through centuries of suppression, through decades of deliberate misdirection. And now, as more activation chambers are discovered, as more researchers brave the threats to document the impossible, as more humans experience directly what they're capable of when freed from limiting beliefs, the remembering has begun. The floating stones are calling to us across time, reminding us that we are far more than we've been taught to believe. The question is, are we ready to answer that call? Are we prepared to remember capabilities that could solve every crisis we face and open possibilities we've only imagined in our wildest dreams? Because deep in the Amazon, in chambers designed to activate consciousness and monuments that defy gravity itself, the answers are waiting. Not just answers about the past, but keys to a future where human potential knows no bounds, and consciousness itself becomes the technology that transforms our world. The choice of whether we claim those keys, whether we remember who we really are, will determine not just our understanding of ancient mysteries, but our ability to create a reality worthy of our true nature as conscious beings, in a universe far more magical than we've been allowed to believe. And in the floating stones of the Amazon, that magic is still waiting for us to come home. The strangest part about investigating consciousness-based technology isn't the floating stones or the impossible engineering. It's the moment you realize that everything you've been taught about the limits of human capability has been carefully constructed to keep you from discovering what you're actually capable of. That realization hit me like a physical blow as I sat in that Amazon jungle, staring at massive granite blocks suspended in midair by forces that mainstream science insists cannot exist. But here's what really kept me awake at night after escaping that canyon. The systematic nature of the suppression goes far beyond hiding archaeological evidence. What I discovered through leaked documents and whistleblower testimonies suggests that consciousness-based technologies have been rediscovered and developed in classified programs for decades, not to benefit humanity, but to maintain control over human potential itself. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former researcher at a classified facility she could only identify as Site 7, contacted me through encrypted channels 3 months after my Amazon experience. What she revealed about modern consciousness research being conducted in underground laboratories made the floating megaliths seem almost mundane by comparison. We weren't just studying ancient artifacts, she told me during a clandestine meeting in a crowded airport terminal. We were reverse engineering consciousness interface technologies and testing them on human subjects. The goal wasn't to understand how these systems worked. We already knew that from decades of previous research. The goal was to determine how to prevent average people from accessing these capabilities, while ensuring that selected individuals could use them for strategic purposes. The implications of her testimony were staggering. If consciousness can indeed manipulate matter directly, if human awareness can access information across space and time, if the floating stones represent technologies that any sufficiently expanded consciousness can operate, then controlling access to these capabilities becomes the ultimate form of power. Not just control over resources or information, but control over the fundamental nature of what humans believe is possible. Dr. Walsh described experimental protocols that sounded like science fiction, but were apparently standard procedure at classified consciousness research facilities. Subjects were placed in chambers lined with materials recovered from megalithic sites, then exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies while their brain activity was monitored and recorded. The goal was to identify individuals with natural consciousness expansion capabilities while documenting the exact conditions that triggered enhanced awareness states. We found that about 3% of the population has natural ability to interface with consciousness-based technologies, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. These individuals can activate ancient systems, manipulate matter through focused intention, and access information that exists outside normal space-time limitations. But here's the terrifying part. We also found ways to suppress these abilities in people who might develop them naturally. The suppression techniques she described were as elegant as they were insidious. Electromagnetic frequencies broadcast through cell phone networks that interfere with brainwave patterns associated with consciousness expansion. Chemical additives in processed foods that dampen the neural pathways required for enhanced awareness states. Educational systems designed to reinforce limiting beliefs about human potential, while discouraging the kind of expanded thinking that might lead to consciousness breakthrough experiences. Even more disturbing were the activation protocols developed for selected individuals deemed suitable for consciousness-based technology programs. Military personnel, intelligence operatives, and corporate executives were being trained to access capabilities that officially didn't exist, giving them advantages in strategic thinking, information acquisition, and influence that their targets couldn't understand or counter. Imagine negotiating with someone who can read your thoughts, Dr. Walsh said, her hands shaking as she spoke. Imagine competing against corporations whose executives can access information directly from quantum fields. Imagine trying to maintain privacy when consciousness-enhanced intelligence agents can perceive your intentions before you're fully aware of them yourself. This explains so much about the seemingly impossible success of certain individuals and organizations. Not just luck or superior strategy, but access to consciousness capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The playing field wasn't level because some players were using technologies that others didn't even know existed. But the most chilling aspect of Dr. Walsh's revelations concerned the long-term goals of these classified programs. The consciousness enhancement technologies recovered from ancient sites weren't being developed to benefit humanity. They were being weaponized to create a permanent class system based on consciousness capability rather than economic or social status. The plan is simple, she explained. Keep the general population suppressed and unaware of their natural consciousness potential, while training selected individuals to access enhanced capabilities. Over time, this creates an unbridgeable gap between those who know what humans are really capable of and those who remain limited by artificial constraints. This wasn't just technological suppression, it was consciousness apartheid. The systematic creation of two different species of human beings, those with access to enhanced awareness capabilities, and those kept artificially limited to baseline consciousness states. And the most insidious part was that the suppressed population would never even know what they were missing. The ancient builders who created the Amazon megaliths had foreseen this possibility. That's why they encoded their consciousness activation technologies in stone monuments scattered across the globe, rather than preserving them in written records that could be controlled or destroyed. They understood that true consciousness capabilities couldn't be permanently suppressed because they're inherent to human nature itself. But they also understood that those capabilities could be temporarily hidden, misdirected, or convinced to remain dormant through sophisticated manipulation of belief systems and environmental factors. The floating stones weren't just technological demonstrations. They were proof that such suppression wouldn't last forever. Evidence that consciousness would eventually remember its true nature, regardless of institutional efforts to keep it limited. Dr. Walsh's decision to become a whistleblower came when she realized that the classified programs she'd worked for weren't just studying consciousness capabilities. They were actively preventing their natural emergence in the general population while accelerating their development in selected individuals. The research wasn't about understanding human potential, it was about controlling it. I watched colleagues use consciousness-enhanced perception to solve problems that normal human intelligence couldn't handle, she told me. I saw military applications that gave operators advantages that bordered on supernatural. And I realized that this knowledge was being deliberately withheld from the people who could benefit most from it. Ordinary humans struggling with problems that consciousness expansion could easily solve. The leaked documents she provided revealed the scope of consciousness suppression efforts that extended far beyond academic censorship or archaeological site control. Pharmaceutical interventions designed to limit awareness expansion. Media programming that reinforced materialist worldviews while ridiculing consciousness-based explanations for anomalous phenomena. Educational curricula that taught students to dismiss their own enhanced awareness experiences as imagination or delusion. But most disturbing were the contingency plans developed for scenarios where consciousness capabilities began emerging naturally in the general population despite suppression efforts. Protocols for discrediting individuals who demonstrated enhanced abilities. Strategies for channeling consciousness expansion into controllable religious or New Age frameworks that prevented practical applications. And ultimately, preparation for using consciousness-enhanced operatives to neutralize threats from naturally awakening individuals. The battle for human consciousness wasn't happening in universities or archaeological sites. It was being fought in the deepest levels of classified programs where the true nature of human potential was being studied, developed, and weaponized by forces that understood its implications far better than the public they were keeping in the dark. But consciousness, as I'd learned in the Amazon activation chamber, is patient, but not passive. The ancient builders who embedded these capabilities in stone monuments also embedded them in human genetics, in the quantum structure of awareness itself, in the very fabric of reality that connects all conscious beings. The suppression could delay awakening, but it couldn't prevent it indefinitely. Dr. Walsh's final words to me before she disappeared back into whatever protection program she'd arranged carried a message of both warning and hope. The consciousness activation sites are spreading, she said. More people are finding them, experiencing them, remembering what they're capable of. The suppressors know this, and they're getting desperate. That makes them dangerous. But it also means they're losing. Consciousness can't be contained forever, and when it breaks free, it will transform everything. As I sat in that airport after our meeting, watching travelers hurry past with their smartphones and their limited awareness of what they might be capable of, I understood that the real battle for human future wasn't being fought with conventional weapons or traditional power structures. It was being fought in the realm of consciousness itself, between those who sought to expand human potential and those who profited from keeping it constrained. The floating stones in the Amazon were just the beginning. Scattered across our planet, hidden in remote locations and protected by indigenous communities, Consciousness activation chambers waited for humans ready to remember their true nature. Each discovery weakened the suppression systems. Each person who experienced enhanced awareness directly challenged the artificial limitations that kept humanity trapped in cycles of scarcity and conflict. The question wasn't whether consciousness would eventually break free from institutional control. The question was how many people would remember their capabilities before the suppressors succeeded in creating permanent separation between the enhanced and the limited, between those who knew what humans could become and those kept ignorant of their own potential. Because deep in the Amazon, in chambers that float massive stones through pure consciousness, the future of human evolution was being determined. Not by governments or corporations or classified programs, but by individuals brave enough to sit in ancient chairs and remember who they really are. And once enough people remembered, once consciousness reached a critical mass of awakened awareness, no amount of suppression could prevent the transformation that would follow. The stones were still floating, still waiting, still calling to consciousness itself. The only question was whether we would answer that call before it was too late to matter. Before the suppressors succeeded in creating a world where enhanced consciousness belonged only to those who would use it to maintain control rather than liberate human potential. The choice, as always, remained in the hands of consciousness itself. And consciousness, patient though it might be, was growing tired of waiting. In the months following my escape from the Amazon Canyon, I began to notice something that chilled me more than any threat from government agents or corporate interests. The consciousness suppression that Dr. Walsh had described wasn't just happening in classified laboratories. It was woven into the fabric of modern life itself, so subtle and pervasive that most people never realized they were being systematically prevented from accessing their natural capabilities. The signs were everywhere once you knew how to look for them. Television programming that promoted passive consumption over active awareness. Social media algorithms that kept people trapped in reactive emotional states rather than expanded consciousness. Educational systems that rewarded memorization and conformity while punishing the kind of creative thinking that might lead to consciousness, breakthrough experiences. But the most insidious suppression occurred through what I came to understand as frequency pollution. The electromagnetic environment of modern civilization was being deliberately manipulated to interfere with the brainwave patterns associated with enhanced awareness states. Cell phone towers, Wi-Fi networks, and countless electronic devices all broadcast on frequencies that research had shown could disrupt the neural oscillations required for consciousness expansion. Dr. Michael Thornton, a neuroscientist who'd worked on classified projects before his conscience drove him to become a whistleblower, explained the mechanism during a clandestine meeting in a location he insisted had to be an underground parking garage to avoid electronic surveillance. The human brain operates on specific frequencies, he told me, his voice echoing off concrete walls. Different consciousness states correspond to different brainwave patterns. Alpha waves for relaxed awareness, theta waves for deep meditation, gamma waves for breakthrough experiences. If you flood the environment with electromagnetic noise on those same frequencies, you can effectively jam consciousness expansion, just like jamming a radio signal. The implications were staggering. Modern humans weren't just being kept ignorant of consciousness capabilities through misinformation and cultural programming. They were being subjected to electromagnetic interference that made enhanced awareness states physically difficult to achieve. The technology that connected us to global information networks was simultaneously disconnecting us from our own consciousness potential. But Dr. Thornton's most disturbing revelation concerned the selective nature of this suppression. Certain individuals, those identified through genetic testing, psychological profiling, and consciousness capability screening, were provided with devices that filtered out the suppressive frequencies while amplifying the brainwave patterns associated with enhanced awareness. It's not that consciousness expansion is impossible in the modern world, he explained. It's that it's being artificially made impossible for most people while being artificially enhanced for a selected few. We're creating two different species of human, those with access to enhanced consciousness, and those kept at baseline awareness levels. This explained the seemingly impossible success of certain individuals in business, politics, and technology. Not just superior intelligence or better opportunities, but access to consciousness states that provided advantages their competitors couldn't understand or counter. Enhanced intuition that allowed perfect timing in financial markets. Expanded awareness that enabled reading social and political dynamics with supernatural accuracy. Direct access to information fields that made strategic planning almost precognitive. The consciousness apartheid that ancient builders had warned against wasn't a future possibility. It was already happening, and most of humanity remained completely unaware that their potential was being systematically limited, while others operated with capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. But consciousness, as I'd learned in the Amazon, has ways of breaking through even the most sophisticated suppression systems. The megalithic sites weren't just consciousness activation chambers. They were also consciousness amplification networks that could overcome artificial interference when accessed by individuals with sufficient natural capability. This is why the archaeological suppression was so critical to maintaining control. The ancient stone networks provided natural consciousness enhancement that could bypass electromagnetic jamming and artificial limitation systems. Anyone who accessed these sites directly could potentially break through to enhanced awareness states, regardless of the suppression technologies deployed in modern civilization. Dr. Sarah Kim, the researcher whose equipment had been confiscated during her Amazon expedition, had discovered something that made the suppressors even more desperate to control access to megalithic sites. The consciousness activation chambers weren't just individual enhancement systems. They were connected to each other through what could only be described as a planetary consciousness network. When you activate one site, she explained during a secure video call from an undisclosed location, it sends signals through the Earth's electromagnetic field to other sites around the world. The entire megalithic network functions as a global consciousness amplification system that can enhance awareness on a planetary scale. The implications were revolutionary. If enough people accessed enough sites simultaneously, the combined consciousness enhancement could potentially overcome the suppression systems that kept most humans limited to baseline awareness. The ancient builders hadn't just preserved individual consciousness technologies, they'd created a planetary awakening system that could trigger species-wide consciousness evolution. But activating this system required reaching critical mass. Enough people accessing enough sites to generate sufficient consciousness enhancement to break through the suppression threshold. And this is where the suppressors focused their most desperate efforts. Not just hiding individual sites, but preventing coordinated access to multiple locations that could trigger planetary consciousness activation. The pattern became clear when I started investigating the timing of archaeological site closures, research permit denials, and funding withdrawals. Every time independent researchers began coordinating efforts to study multiple megalithic locations simultaneously, institutional interference intensified. Not just individual suppression, but systematic prevention of the kind of collaborative investigation that might accidentally trigger planetary consciousness enhancement. This explained why the ancient Amazon sites were so heavily protected. They weren't just consciousness activation chambers. They were key nodes in a global network that could potentially awaken human consciousness on a scale that would make current suppression systems irrelevant. If enough people accessed the floating stone chambers while others simultaneously activated sites in Egypt, Peru, Cambodia, and other locations worldwide, the combined consciousness enhancement might break through every artificial limitation that kept humanity trapped in cycles of scarcity and conflict. The race was on, suppressors working desperately to maintain control over consciousness activation sites, while independent researchers and indigenous communities fought to preserve access to technologies that could transform human civilization. And in the background, more people were naturally awakening to enhanced awareness states, despite the electromagnetic jamming and cultural programming designed to prevent such breakthroughs. Social media, for all its manipulation and distraction, was also connecting awakening individuals who might never have found each other otherwise. Online communities were forming around consciousness expansion, meditation practices, and anomalous experiences that challenged materialist worldviews. Despite the suppression systems, despite the frequency pollution, despite the systematic hiding of consciousness-based technologies, human awareness was finding ways to expand and connect. The tipping point was approaching. Every person who remembered their consciousness capabilities weakened the suppression systems. Every successful activation of an ancient site sent enhancement signals through the planetary network. Every breakthrough experience demonstrated that artificial limitations could be overcome through sufficient awareness and intention. But the suppressors understood this as well. Their responses were becoming more extreme, more desperate, more willing to use any means necessary to prevent planetary consciousness activation. The stakes weren't just academic or archaeological anymore, they were existential. Either consciousness would break free from institutional control, or humanity would be permanently divided into enhanced and limited subspecies. The floating stones in the Amazon weren't just waiting for individual activation. They were part of a global consciousness network preparing for species-wide awakening. The question wasn't whether this awakening would happen. Consciousness was patient, but inexorable. The question was whether it would happen before the suppressors succeeded in making the division permanent. And deep in hidden chambers around the world, in stone networks that connected continents and consciousness itself, the countdown to planetary transformation had already begun. The ancient builders had embedded their final gift, not just in individual sites, but in the quantum fabric of awareness itself. When enough humans remembered their true nature, when sufficient consciousness activated simultaneously, the suppression systems would collapse like sandcastles before a tsunami of awakened awareness. The stones were still floating, still calling, still waiting for consciousness to come home, but they wouldn't wait forever. The time for remembering was now, while the choice between enhancement and limitation could still be made freely. Soon, that choice might be made for us by forces that understood human potential better than humans understood themselves. The question remained: would we answer the call of consciousness before it was too late? Would we remember who we are and what we're capable of becoming? Or would we remain limited by artificial constraints while others claimed the consciousness capabilities that rightfully belong to all humanity? The floating stones held the answer, and time was running out to claim it. The final piece of evidence I need to share with you comes from a source so close to the heart of this suppression that even mentioning their existence puts lives at risk. 3 weeks after my last contact with Dr. Walsh, I received a package with no return address, containing documents that revealed the true scope of what we're dealing with. Inside were blueprints, not architectural drawings or engineering schematics, but consciousness maps. Detailed diagrams showing how human awareness can be systematically channeled, directed, and controlled through environmental manipulation. The documents describe something called Project Baseline, a decades-long operation to establish what they termed consciousness bandwidth limitations in the general population. The methodology was breathtaking in its sophistication. Frequency generators disguised as cellular infrastructure. Chemical compounds introduced through water treatment facilities that subtly altered neurotransmitter production. Educational curricula designed not just to limit critical thinking, but to actively suppress the brain development patterns associated with enhanced awareness states. But the most chilling revelation was the timeline. Project Baseline hadn't been implemented to respond to consciousness awakening. It had been deployed preemptively, decades before most people even knew that enhanced awareness was possible. The suppressors hadn't discovered ancient consciousness technologies and then decided to control them. They had inherited this knowledge from previous generations, who had been managing human consciousness potential for centuries. The Amazon megaliths weren't the first consciousness activation sites to be suppressed. Similar operations had been conducted at Stonehenge, at the pyramids of Giza, at temples in Cambodia and Peru. Every major ancient site that demonstrated consciousness-based technologies had been quietly studied, reverse engineered, and then hidden from public access while the recovered capabilities were weaponized for institutional control. We weren't dealing with a recent conspiracy to hide archaeological discoveries. We were confronting a multi-generational project to maintain artificial limitations on human consciousness while selectively enhancing the awareness capabilities of those deemed suitable for positions of power and influence. The floating stones in the Amazon represented something that terrified the suppressors more than any other discovery. Proof that consciousness-based technologies were becoming active again despite centuries of concealment. The ancient network wasn't just preserving knowledge for future generations. It was beginning to spontaneously reactivate as human consciousness reached sufficient levels of development to interface with the systems. This explained the desperate escalation in suppression efforts, archaeological sites being declared off-limits, researchers being threatened or eliminated, indigenous communities being relocated away from activation chambers. The suppressors weren't just hiding static evidence anymore. They were trying to prevent an awakening process that had already begun, but they were fighting against forces they couldn't fully control. Consciousness itself was evolving, developing capabilities that transcended the artificial limitations that had been imposed. More people were naturally accessing enhanced awareness states despite the electromagnetic jamming. More activation sites were being discovered faster than they could be suppressed. The planetary consciousness network that ancient builders had embedded in stone was beginning to function again. The documents in that anonymous package contained one final revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about human potential. Buried in technical specifications and operational protocols was a single line that made my hands shake as I read it. Baseline consciousness suppression becomes ineffective when planetary activation threshold reaches approximately 0.3% of population. 0.3%. Out of 8 billion people, that meant roughly 24 million individuals needed to access enhanced consciousness states simultaneously to trigger irreversible planetary awakening. 24 million people who remembered their true capabilities, who broke through the artificial limitations, who accessed the consciousness technologies that had been hidden for so long. The suppressors had been desperately calculating this number for decades, deploying every possible method to prevent it from being reached. But their own documents revealed that the threshold was approaching despite their efforts. Natural consciousness evolution, combined with increasing access to activation sites, was creating a momentum that conventional suppression methods couldn't stop. We stood at the edge of a transformation that would render every current power structure obsolete. Not through revolution or political change, but through the simple remembering of capabilities that had always been inherent to human consciousness. When enough people accessed their natural potential, when sufficient awareness activated simultaneously, the suppression systems would collapse not through external attack, but through internal irrelevance. The floating stones weren't just archaeological anomalies or technological demonstrations. They were beacons calling to consciousness itself, accelerating the awakening process that would eventually free humanity from artificial limitations that had constrained our species for centuries. But the race to that threshold wasn't without danger. The suppressors understood the stakes as well as anyone. Their responses were becoming increasingly extreme as they realized that conventional control methods were failing. The threats to researchers, the elimination of evidence, the systematic hiding of activation sites, all represented desperate attempts to prevent an awakening that had already passed the point of no return. Every person who remembered their consciousness capabilities brought us closer to that critical threshold. Every successful activation of an ancient site sent enhancement signals through the planetary network. Every breakthrough experience demonstrated that artificial limitations were temporary constructs that consciousness could transcend when sufficiently motivated. The Amazon had shown me floating stones suspended by pure consciousness, chambers designed to amplify awareness, technologies that revealed the true nature of human potential. But more importantly, it had shown me that we weren't alone in this remembering. Ancient builders had prepared for this moment, embedding awakening systems in stone networks that spanned the globe, ensuring that consciousness would eventually remember its true nature, regardless of institutional efforts to maintain control. The suppressors could hide individual sites, intimidate researchers, and deploy electromagnetic jamming. But they couldn't suppress consciousness itself. They couldn't prevent the natural evolution of awareness that was accelerating with each passing day. They couldn't stop the awakening that had been building momentum for decades, approaching a threshold that would transform human civilization in ways they couldn't control or predict. The floating stones were still there, still calling, still waiting for consciousness to come home. But they weren't just waiting anymore. They were actively participating in an awakening process that extended far beyond any single sight or discovery. They were part of a planetary transformation that had been set in motion by builders who understood that consciousness could never be permanently contained, only temporarily delayed. The time for delay was ending. The threshold was approaching. And somewhere in the quantum fabric of awareness itself, in the stone networks that connected continents and consciousness, the final phase of human awakening had already begun. The question was no longer whether we would remember our true capabilities. The question was whether we would remember them soon enough to choose our own transformation rather than having it chosen for us by forces that understood our potential better than we understood ourselves. Because deep in the Amazon, in chambers where stones float through pure consciousness, the countdown to planetary awakening was accelerating. And when it reached zero, everything would change. The stones knew it. The suppressors feared it. And consciousness itself was preparing for the moment when artificial limitations would finally give way to the unlimited potential that had always been our birthright as aware beings in a universe far more conscious than we had been allowed to remember. The floating stones were coming home, and they were bringing humanity with them.